So let's do as we do and begin in silence. Just do what it takes for you to be here. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in my mouth and in my speaking. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. I don't do this often enough, but thank you for being here. Thank you for your faithful attendance in ordinary life and for your listening, hearing. It takes great listening to make good teaching, so to the extent that my teaching's worth anything, it's all up to you. So I hope you bear that responsibility well. And I'm also grateful for the theme that has found me for this year, which is living in the sacred stream, because it seems to be resonating with folks. There's something oddly interesting and interestingly odd about getting involved with wise and useful spiritual teaching. On the one hand, they stir up hope and excitement that we might experience what we came here for, healing and wholeness. And on the other hand, they stir up anxiety that we might actually be led into new territory. It's very paradoxical. These are the two fears that we have when we gather for something like this. We gather with the anticipation of hearing something other than the same old thing. I want to strike fire with what I say, for I want you to think, feel, and experience that being here is worth your time. And you do too. You went to the trouble of being here with all that entails, and you don't want this to be a waste of your time. That's true. But at the same time, what if something does happen? I love the story of the Pentecostal man who wandered into a church like St. Paul's one Sunday. Now, you may not be aware of it, but St. Paul's building, cathedral, church, whatever you want to call that structure, is on the registry of historic buildings in the United States. And years and years ago, when we were trying to come up with what at the time was a very popular thing to do, a mission statement, you remember a mission statement? The mission statement that we came up with began with St. Paul's as a sacred space in the heart of Houston. And that's the way a lot of people experience it. It's the way I first experienced it when I walked in the building. We, being on the historic registry and being in the museum district, we get people who wander into our building all during the week from all over the world, who, because they're at the museum and they see the structure and they come across. And we are what is referred to either positively or negatively high church, meaning that we are in the Wesleyan Anglican tradition. We are a lectionary church with all that that involves. But I want to be clear that it was not this church that this guy wandered into, but it was one very like this church. Pentecostal guy. and he had never been in a worship service like this before. There was a sung introit, and then there was the processional down the aisle with the cross and the banner and the choir and the Bible and another cross. And then the first hymn concluded and the first lesson was read, and then a psalm was sung. There was an epistle reading, another hymn. This Sunday there was a gospel procession, which means that an acolyte and candle bearers and others come into the chancel and they take the reading out into the middle of the congregation, and one of the clergy assigned for reading the gospel that Sunday reads it. All the congregation turns to face that reading, and this Pentecostal guy had never experienced anything like this in his life. The preacher for the day got up and began his sermon, and not 5 minutes into it, the Pentecostal man said, "Amen." Now, we're not used to that sort of thing. So people turned and stared disapprovingly at him. The sermon was on non-judgment that day. The preacher continued, and after a few more minutes, the Pentecostal man exclaimed, "Hallelujah!" The ushers were getting concerned. They wondered if they needed to call security. Sure enough, another few minutes passed, and the man shouted out, "Praise the Lord!" By this time, the head usher was down beside the guy, leaned over and said to him, "You got to be quiet. The preacher's right in the middle of his sermon." And the Pentecostal man said, "Be quiet. How can I be quiet? I've got the Holy Spirit." And the usher said, "Well, you didn't get it in this church." We love the illusion that we are in control. Some of you know that I have conducted 2 memorial services here in the past 8 days. One was for a woman where death was a release. And more often than not, death occurs like that for many in our culture. Even if the death is what we call premature, there's usually some warning. There's a diagnosis, a condition of some sort. But then, like the person we memorialized yesterday, there is a sudden, very unexpected collapse, and you're gone. And you just never know. If we're going to move beyond where we are, which is the title I've given this time today, we're going to have to be continually open to having our eyes open to see the possibilities of what it's like to live on this planet with a human body. I had a professor in seminary who loved to quote a Jewish mystic by the name of Israel ben Eleazar. He's also known as the Baal Shem Tov. This Jewish mystic was born in 1698, and he is considered the founder of Hasidic Judaism. Now, the title Baal Shem Tov means, among other things, it can be variously translated, but it means one with a good reputation. And the line that my professor loved was, "The world is full of wonders and miracles, but man takes his little hand and covers his eyes and sees nothing." Now, the Baal Shem Tov was such a wise man that I'm sure had he lived in our time, he would have not made this so sexist. But the fact is that we do have eyes and seldom see. So we've been going through the Jesus narrative to help carry us in the sacred stream. And we're up to dealing with miracles, and we're not through with that. We'll come back after Easter and continue. Many of you from Sunday school know that after Jesus spent time with John the Baptist was put in prison, and that evidently is about what spurred Jesus to start his own ministry. John is in prison because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. He'd irritated the authorities, and after a while he's very discouraged. So he sends a message to Jesus. And the message is, are you the one that we had been expected, or should we look for somebody else? Now, this is another one of those instances where Jesus does not answer the question. Jesus answers, according to the narratives that we have, only 3 questions in the entirety of his ministry. He asks a lot of questions, but he answers only 3. And he doesn't answer this one directly. Rather, he says to the messengers, go tell John what you have heard and what you have seen. And then Jesus quotes from Isaiah. It's a passage that is regularly read on Rosh Hashanah. And what Isaiah says is that human wholeness will replace human brokenness. And the line from Isaiah is really quite specific. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing. So, in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus quotes this text, or these words are put into the mouth of Jesus. And what the people who are sent to Jesus by John are told when they ask, are you the one? They are told to say what they saw and heard, which was that the blind saw, the lame hear, the deaf are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Now, in order for Jesus to be said to be the Messiah, there would need to be signs attributed to Jesus that would make people think that this is indeed the Messiah. This is why various miracle stories are wrapped around the life of Jesus. The miracle stories told about Jesus are parables that the early followers of Jesus told about Jesus. This is one of the reasons that these miracle stories are so late in showing up in the tradition. They were not ever events that, quote, actually happened as we would have seen on the 10 o'clock news. Any more than Moses could literally part the Red Sea, or Joshua could stop the sun in the sky. Those are parables. Now, there are people who take what I just said as heresy. The same way that some people take the news that there's no hell for people to burn in torment forever as heresy. I personally see that as kind of good news. The burden of doing miraculous things is distracting to the memory and history of Jesus. One of the signs mentioned by Isaiah and quoted by Jesus is that a new era was arriving, which Jesus referred to as the rule of God, in contrast to the rule of Caesar. And one sign was that people would have their sight restored. They would be able to see. And being able to see is both the heart and the content of spiritual practice. So there is a story told in the Christian scripture where a group of pompous religious leaders. Now, I know it's hard for you to imagine that there are pompous religious leaders, but there are. This woman was caught in the act of adultery. And they brought her to Jesus in an attempt to entrap him. And they said, Moses said that such a person should be stoned. What do you say? And in essence, Jesus said, that sounds like a good idea. Let the one who is among you, who has no sin, cast the first stone. Now, this is not what they were expecting, and it threw them for a loop. So, in the presence of Jesus, the scales fell away from these people's eyes, and one by one, these religious leaders slunk away. Now, I fear that if this story were told in our time, the religious leaders would have quickly been picking up stones and throwing them. At least there seems to be a lot of blame and accusation and fault-finding being flung about today, especially by religious people. People all over are claiming to be righteous and superior and so forth. Whereas the leaders in this story are disarmed, literally, and where they were willing to walk away, we live in a culture where people are more and more willing to turn to violence. We are a culture that amasses armaments. So one of the things claimed by Jesus, about Jesus, is that he cured many people of blindness. So while working on this talk, I ran across some words by Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher. He lived in a time before people were given last names. His father was very poor, and they lived near a church, in a churchyard, and Kierkegaard means churchyard. That's what the name comes from. He's a very pivotal person in the thought and the evolution of Christian thought and philosophy. The words I read by Kierkegaard were these: there are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true. The other is to refuse to accept what is true. And we live in a time and culture where both forms of this foolishness exist. Thank you. So here's something that's true. Evolution. And the increasingly new knowledge we have about the nature of the cosmos. And yet, institutional Christianity embraces a picture of reality of an external deity disconnected from the earth who manages to manipulate people and circumstances for his own purpose. Somebody asked me if I would continue to clarify what I mean by the moral obligation to be happy. And why is it that if we know what we know about how to fulfill that moral obligation, that is by loving one another, being compassionate and empathetic and practicing kindness, we're still not happy? And we have a society of people who are constantly seeking for other and better ways to be happy. Now, I have a multitude of responses to this matter. I can't deal with all of them today, but I want to come at a partial answer. Keeping in mind today that we're talking about the miracle of healing and the miracle of seeing, and that we need to move beyond where we are. Okay? And that's both hopeful and terrifying. First of all, life and we who live it are complicated beyond my ability to say. For example, let's suppose that you went to see a competent counselor or a spiritual director, and you come into the session and you get seated and you take a space in, you look around, and then the person you're seeing says, "What's brought you here today?" And you would have to have an answer to that. Or a question that I almost always ask is, what would be a good outcome of our time today? And you respond with whatever you say, and then the person asks you some more questions, and you respond. And this goes on for 50 minutes. And at the end of that time, both you and the person you're seeing are aware that you are just getting started. You haven't yet scratched the surface. The reason that you have gone to the therapist, counselor, director has really not yet been addressed. You're testing out, seeing if it's safe, that sort of thing. I remember offering a dream to my analyst when I was in training, and he said something like, we'll probably still be processing that 6 weeks from now. No quick answers, no quick fixes. But that's the culture we live in. We want it like that. And life is not that way. Here's another way to get at the answer. I have this small painting by a Spanish artist that Sherry gave me 45 years ago, I'm guessing. It's been with me ever since. I have it sitting by the chair in my office, and it's moved with me from the time I got it to every office I've had. And I was thinking about that and sharing that with you, and whether that would be seen as competency or incompetency, but I've had 7 offices since I got this. I have a place where I can see it, either from my desk or from my chair, and it's impossible if you come in my office and sit, you cannot not see it. I never call attention to it. But it never ceases to amaze me when, in the process of our working together, people will say something like, "Wow, that's interesting. Did you just get that?" They just see it. There's a seeing that fits our work. And we all know what this cage is like. The artist gave the title of this little painting, Prison. And the prison that we are in consists of the fact that we are dealing with things, we're locked into dealing with things in a way that we think will solve our dilemma that won't. And usually the things that we're dealing with, and I mentioned this last week, is that we're dealing with being depressed or anxious. All of us. Me, you, all of us. No exceptions. Jim Hollis says that when he does his workshops, he will ask people to write down something about where they're stuck. And everybody can do it. So just hold that reality in one hand for a moment. Now, put in the other hand the religion of our culture. We may spend an hour I don't know what your daily spiritual practice consists of. But let's just say it's 20 minutes a day. Doing work like we're trying to do right now, raising our awareness, raising the level of information and knowledge that we have, trying to be more skillful, trying to be wiser. And then we get up from that meditation and we go to be immersed in a world of consumerism, competitiveness, and comparing. And Carl Jung said, if you don't tell the world who you are, it will tell you. And the message of the world constantly in our culture is, you don't have enough. You need more. You're not enough. The way you look, anything, you need more. And it just seeps in. Now, we can know at the rational level that happiness is the byproduct of living lives of loving compassion and service. But the tug of our religion is so powerful that we can forget that. I took a course once in meditation from Jack Kornfield. Jack Kornfield is a little clinical psychologist who's also a devoted Buddhist, and I took a course from him in Vipassana meditation. And he was saying then, you need to have a daily spiritual practice, maybe an hour a day. And people were going, oh, God. Where am I going to get an hour a day? I don't have an hour a day. And Kornfield said, I can tell you how to get an hour a day like that if you'll do it. Everybody got their notebooks out and we're going to write it down. He said, unplug your TV. Well, my mother had a phrase for that. You'd gone from preaching to meddling. There's this duck that walks into a bar. And he says to the bartender, you got any grapes? And the bartender says, no. The duck walks out. Duck comes back the next day and asks the bartender, you got any grapes? And the bartender says, no. The duck walks out. The duck keeps doing this over and over and over and walks in, asks the bartender, have you got any grapes? And the bartender says, no, we don't have any grapes. He loses his patience about this matter and not just being curious, but now irritated about the grapes. He says, I don't have any grapes. We don't sell grapes here. And further, if you come back asking that again, I'm going to nail your bill to the bar so you can't say that again. The duck frowns, walks out of the bar. The next day, the duck walks back into the bar and asks the bartender, got any nails? The bartender says, no, and the duck says, got any grapes? So I fear bringing up what I'm about to bring up because you're going to take nails and nail my lips to the podium so I can't come back. Nevertheless, you've got to know this material. This comes from Jim Marion's book, The Levels of Cognitive Development. The majority of our culture lives at this mythic level of consciousness. And we all have it. It's part of our DNA. Oh God, why did this happen to me? I need a parking place. You know the prayers that we make. It's at the rational level that we're doing the work right here that we're doing. Hopefully, it is at the vision logic level that most of us live, because it's at the vision logic level where the values of truth and love and justice and freedom come. Okay? However, it is only at these two higher levels that we can know the sacred. At the earlier levels, we can know about the sacred. At the psychic consciousness and the Christ consciousness, we can know the sacred. This is why when Carl Jung was asked, "Do you believe in God?" he said, "No. I know God." You cannot know God at the vision logic level. Now, this has social practicability. As individuals change, so do groups. How we live, what we bring into the world, makes a difference in the world. Now, you might remember a few weeks ago, I went with a mic into this crowd and ask you to think of the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word religion and when you hear the word Christian. The responses are not overwhelmingly positive, particularly when it comes to Christian. I'm going to read you something that Peter Werner wrote in The Atlantic 2 weeks ago. One might reasonably expect that Christians, including white evangelicals, would be a unifying, healing force in American society. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God, Jesus said. Yet in the main, the white evangelical movement has for decades exacerbated our divisions, fueled hatreds and grievances, and turned fellow citizens into enemies rather than friends. White evangelical Christians are the most consistently reliable supporters of the most polarizing and morally depraved president in American history. It has hurt America. It has done tremendous damage to the witness of the Christian faith. Now, Jesus made a difference in the world, or we wouldn't be sitting here. And I personally have the faith that following in the way that he taught, we can experience the transformation that he talked about. But first, we have to see. We have to see ourselves in need of that. We have to see each other. We have to see the suffering world. So a very effective way of doing this seeing on the living of your life when it comes to making significant decisions is asking the question, does this choice I'm about to make, or does this way of living that I have, enlarge me or diminish me? Do I bring enlargement to the world or not? Choosing the large is difficult until we realize the difficulty of choosing the small. Now, many people bring into the living of their lives the message from childhood that the world is too big, too overwhelming, you're too small, too weak, you're inadequate to deal with it, you're not enough. What you're looking at is a piece of art called it's got a long name, The Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nations Millennium General Assembly. It's at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. This is the work of a janitor. James Hampton was a janitor for the federal government. And by day, he swept the floors and cleaned toilets, and by night, he worked on this. Slowly, with tinfoil from 1,000 pieces of chewing gum and the fragments discarded by a bored public passing through the buildings in his custodial care, he assembled this vision. No help, no financial support, didn't make a big deal of it. But this is what he brought into the world. For all of us, there is a larger summons. I don't know what yours is. But as a counselor, I can tell you that so far, there has not been a person I have sat with who's not had the thought, other people got their act together better than I do. Therefore, I won't show myself. My point is that every one of us is dealing with her or his own set of anxieties and losses. But in the process of pretending that we got it all together, we end up being strangers not only to ourselves, but to each other. Now, the move from one cognitive level to another to go beyond where we currently are means going through these fears and depressions. Not around them, not over them, but through them. There's no magic. There is no shortcut. Seeing is hard. That's why I brought up the subject of death. Sometimes death can open our eyes to the preciousness of life. Now, Richard Rohr says, pardon me, Richard Rohr says that there are two ways to move from one developmental level to another. And one way is by way of a great personal tragedy. You lose a child, God forbid. Lose your partner unexpectedly. You get diagnosed with some condition and the doctor says, we've done all we can. That's one way. The other way is by having a daily spiritual practice. Take your pick. Now, if you have a daily spiritual practice, it's hard. I think it's one of the reasons that people don't do it, because you encounter one humiliation after another in daily spiritual practice. One of the reasons that in daily spiritual practice we use incense, which I was going to light, but I can't do it today. I won't do it because of the fire alarms. I had a buddy who was a magician years ago who, in a breakout room at a national conference he was hired to do, had a prediction trick where he burned something in an envelope and it set off the sprinkler system in the room. He was not invited back. And we use incense and we use a bell because we smelling something, hearing something immediately shifts our level of awareness. It changes our consciousness. We move from one level of consciousness to another. So you hear the bell, you hear the chimes, and then within seconds come the judgments and the evaluations. That was such a pretty sound, or that was off key, or that didn't last long enough. Or I wonder if I got some times like those that would help my daily spiritual practice. Evaluations and judgments just come right immediately. And the trick is to notice those evaluations and judgments without evaluating and judging. It's hard. You just notice. And if you do that, you will begin to notice that the space increases between stimulus and response. So if we enter this deep meditation, and I'm quoting Jim Finley here, I got this idea from him. And if we enter the deep meditation and we open our eyes and we saw as Jesus saw, and Finley says what we would see is that we would see God. Jesus saw God in everything. And this is the level of Christ consciousness. It's not easy to get to, and I do a disservice if I create the illusion that it is. What Jesus saw was that people didn't see, but that they were just as much a part of sacred mystery as he was, but they didn't see that about ourselves, and we needed healing of every impediment that kept or keeps us from living out of this wholeness. And that's the healing that's in the journey. So that means going beyond where we are always. It's a never-ending journey, and that going beyond is not easy. So I mentioned that every one of us is affected by anxiety and depression. Years ago, Dr. Jim Bankston preached a sermon here in which he told the story of a traveling salesman back during the day when there was such an animal. And this traveling salesman had come from the north to the south to sell his wares, and his first morning in some southern state, he goes to the diner to eat breakfast. And there with his bacon, eggs, biscuits, and gravy and coffee, he sees a substance on the plate that he's never seen before. And he calls the waitress over and says, "What's this?" And she said, "That's grits." And he said, "Well, I didn't order grits." And she said, "Nobody orders grits down here. They just come." If you have a body and you're conscious, anxiety and depression just come. Sometimes so low grade we pay them no attention. Besides, we have these wonderful ways of numbing ourselves and withdrawing. But Jesus saw what all great spiritual teachers saw and see. We suffer. To have a body is to suffer. To love is to suffer. And Jesus' response was not to avoid or evade, but compassionate relating. And he calls us to be like that with each other, but we can't be like that unless we are honest with ourselves and risk that with each other. So one of the growing requirements of this work is patience. And we're not patient people. So let's say that you have come to this place here, or you've come to see a therapist or a counselor or a spiritual director. And the reason that you've come is that you recognize that you are dealing with this suffering, maybe even an unspeakable loss. You're traumatized, let's just say. And the first thing that I would say to you in that circumstance is, I am so sorry this has happened to you. Period. Full stop. We don't do that in our culture. When somebody shares immense grief with us, we say, oh, I know exactly what you're going through, or you ought to read this book, or you ought to. I have had 3 or 4 original theological sites in my lifetime. I want to share one of them with you. It is genuine grief. Now, a lot of things we grieve over are petty, don't amount to what my father would call a hill of beans. Genuine grief, honestly shared. Now, honesty here means open-ended. You don't box somebody in. You don't have expected answers. Genuine grief, honestly shared, not fixed. Take this pill, do this exercise, do whatever, it'll be okay. Genuine grief, honestly shared, not fixed, is grace. That is the miracle of the community of AA. My situation is hopeless, I am out of control, and the response is, I see you. Period. So if you're in such a condition of unspeakable, unbearable grief, you might say, when asked how you're doing, you would say, I'm so depressed. And you are. I'm so scared. And you are. You are depression. You are grief. And after a while, when asked, how are you doing, the answer will become, well, I am not as depressed as I used to be. You get the split. We have an observer now of the depression. In the beginning, we can't do that for ourselves. That's why we need each other. I see you. I'm so sorry. I will sit with you. And it is in that context that our blindness is healed and we hear and we begin to be able to get up and move about. Sight, hearing, lameness. We know because we are known. Amazing grace. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will see me home. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this. You carry precious cargo, so watch your step and have a happy Easter. See you.